So before the lunch break, we had the panel on alternative pathways, and Barney finished on that panel with talking about data. I didn't plant that comment. Fortuitously, we actually have a panel on data next, and it's titled Getting It Right, Equity, Policy and Data. The moderator for this panel session is my colleague, Associate Professor Gemma Cadby. Gemma is the Director of the Data Program at ACSES, where she leads the development and delivery of the interactive Data 2 and Data Insight series, key resources that support higher education stakeholders in shaping equity strategies. Her work focuses on improving the accessibility, accuracy, and usability of equity data across the sector to enable informed, evidence-based decision-making. Gemma brings extensive experience in genetic epidemiology and data linkage from her previous roles at the University of Western Australia and the WA Department of Health. Gemma and panel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to this session called Getting It Right, Equity, Policy and Data. So as a data lover, I'm really excited and a little bit nervous to be chairing this session today. And we have some really fantastic panellists who I think also love talking about data. So I'm really excited. So we're going to do about an hour of presentations with some slides as well this time, and then also about 20 minutes for Q&A through Slido. And then we're going to finish with a 10-minute interactive activity. But don't worry, it will be easy. It's all through Slido. There won't be any butcher's paper or sticky notes. And we'll be discussing what data you think is missing from higher education. Just before I introduce and then hear from our panellists, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit. So we've heard over the last day and a half that we really are in a time of change. So we have the formation of interim ATEC and then the introduction of ATEC next year. We have the ending of HEP funding and the introduction of needs-based funding. We heard yesterday about the complex financing issues in terms of enrolments. We also heard about the proposed merging of several learning and teaching organisations by the Minister. We've got increased funding for enabling programs. And we also have an introduction of enhanced mission-based compacts. And finally, a focus on evaluation as well in understanding what works for equity students. So I think these changes all give us an opportunity to think carefully about the data we collect, how we use it, and then how we can be strategic and innovative in improving equity outcomes for students. We also know there are challenges. There's plenty of data in higher education, but it's often not in the hands of people who need it most. And also we know that data systems, both within universities and across the whole system, often aren't linked up. They don't talk to each other. So it can be really hard to actually analyse that data or even get access to it. So that brings us to today's panel. And for the next 40 minutes, our panellists will share examples of how higher education data can be used innovatively to drive equity, inform decisions and improve outcomes. So I'll now introduce our panellists. So we have Kristy Naylor, who is Director of Market Analysis and Data Reform at the Department of Education. Kristy oversees Australia's national higher education statistics, a vital resource used across government to shape policy, calculate entitlements and support decision-making. Fiona Navin is Director of Access and Equity at Edith Cowan University. Fiona works to embed equitable and inclusive practices across the university, creating a welcoming environment that supports students and staff from diverse backgrounds. Geoffrey Mitchell is Project Manager for Queensland's Widening Tertiary Participation Consortium and an ACSES visiting scholar. Geoffrey supports statewide outreach and engagement activities, managing data collections and analysing participation trends to improve access for underrepresented students. And Angela Baker is Director, Education Sector at the Social Research Centre. In Angela's work, she helps institutions use data strategically to enhance student outcomes, building strong sector relationships and promoting the effective use of quilt data. So welcome to all of you and thank you so much for being on this panel today. And the question that we've sort of asked our panellists to speak to is, what is an example of an innovative or impactful use of data in higher education? So we're going to start with Angela. And I think there's some slides as well. So Angela, your work with Quilt is central to understanding the student experience and graduate outcomes. Could you tell us a little bit about the Quilt data and then how you've seen it make a difference?
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, thanks, Gemma. By way of a little bit of extra context, I was trained as an evolutionary botanist and worked as an academic for the first third of my career, but through a few sliding door moments, which started with me moving to Australia to work at Monash, I became a specialist in customer experience and service design for banks, industry super funds, airlines. And so I come back to the university sector with the idea of how do I take some of those ideas that I've grew over 15 years working for commercial organizations and apply it to student experience. So some of the examples we saw this morning from Georgia State are things that commercial organizations do all of the time and have been doing for about 15 to 20 years. So some of the examples that I'll talk about are a combination of how I've applied and how we at the Social Research Centre are starting to think about applying some of those methods to Quilt data. What Quilt is, for those who are uninitiated to Quilt, is the quality indicators for learning and teaching. The biggest part of Quilt is the student experience survey. We interview through an online survey about 250,000 students a year, commencing and completing students across the higher education sector. When you look at the types of metrics that are included in Quilt, they can broadly be grouped into 5 areas: the quality of teaching and engagement, skills development, learning and resources, student support, and well-being. We have started using advanced analytics to explore what of those items drive student experience the most. So Quilt largely measures performance. How good is one institution doing on those metrics compared to other institutions is probably how it's most commonly used. What we've started doing is actually going, well, what's most important, in using advanced analytics to do that. We know from looking at the Quilt data this way that teaching quality is the biggest driver. That's irrespective of individual demographics, whether or not you're a member of an equity group. So there are some universal truths in the Quilt data about what is important to students. But what we also know when we look at the parts of Quilt that measure well-being and a sense of belonging is that students with a higher personal well-being index rate their educational experience more positively. Equity groups do not have high personal well-being indexes in the Quilt data. So it suggests there is something going on there that means the sector has to work harder to ensure the well-being of equity students in equity groups. The modules around personal well-being are fairly new to Quilt, so they were just introduced in 2023. So this is something we're also working with the sector and encouraging the sector to talk to us about how to use that data and some of the advanced analytics that you can do. I wanted to give a couple of other examples and maybe warnings about how you can think about the Quilt data. As I mentioned before, a lot of times people use it for comparative insights. How are we going compared to them? But you actually need to do a more nuanced analysis where you actually start to think about your student cohort and what are the different drivers or the different strategies you would employ for different groups of significance to in your student base. This is particularly the case when you're trying to sort of improve things for particular groups of students. So what we end up doing in our data is really then focused analysis by cohorts, focused analysis by combining research data with institutional data by interrogating the verbatims. And I guess I'll harken back to something we've heard in a couple of the other sessions. You can do all the analysis and collect all the data, but you also need to measure success. So when you establish program, you use the data to inform program design, improvement design. How do you also set up measures of success, whether you track that in Quilt, whether you track that in your institutional data? Can you see an impact? And I think that's why there were a lot of people oohing and ahhing during the Georgia State presentation this morning, because you can actually see the real impact of the initiatives that the school has undertaken. So I guess that's something else that I would say is incredibly important. And I won't give away the organizations that we have worked with to do some of these improvements, but I'm happy at the break if people want to talk to me specifically about some of the programs we've helped individual universities put in place.
Thanks, Angela. That was a great overview. Can I just ask a question that isn't scripted, so I've gone a bit rogue? Currently, the Student Experience Survey and the Graduate Outcome Survey aren't linked. Is that right?
They are linked in the sense that we can follow students through SES and GOS. We have actually started, for those of you going to the AIR conference later in the year, we're actually working on a piece of research to combine the GOS data and the SES data to understand student outcomes.
Okay.
So we can do that, and institutions can do that because you have the unique IDs in the data sets that we provide to you. So that's a really powerful way to trace back what's happening. One other answer to that. The other thing we're doing is we know which students complete SES in, say, year 1. We can see if they show up in our sample file for year 2. So we have a sense of what students have left or dropped out. We're starting to do modelling to understand what drives that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So now, Geoffrey, so you're managing Queensland's Widening Tertiary Participation Consortium. Could you share with us how you use that data and what you've learnt from it?
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So in terms of an era of change, that's certainly around in Queensland. So after 16 years of statewide collaboration on widening tertiary participation involving all 7 Queensland universities and ACU as the other public university in Queensland, the formal MOU to collaborate will come to an end at the end of this year. It doesn't mean that collaboration will end, and we're still working on that transformation. But in terms of some of the things we've done and what we've been able to do with data, is that collaboration has enabled us to get access to data that individual universities can't get. So we've got Queensland Education Department data, our Curriculum Authority data, and our Tertiary Admission Centre data. And we've been using that in different ways to help us better target schools, to understand what's happening in different schools, monitor things, and evaluate. And it's also helped us change our perspective on what's needed. For example, understanding the need for more focus on academic preparation and alternate pathways to university. In a previous collaboration with ACSES, under its former name, working with Ian, Paul, Nadine Zacharias, we did a large quantitative and qualitative study, and looking at that data we had gathered, we were able to see a significant impact for some students, for students who had intensive engagement with widening participation. But that was in an era when we had demand-driven funding and the system was growing, and apart from regional and remote students who didn't do so well, other equity groups were improving their participation. What's looking at that data now, in a different era when domestic demand is declining, we see that widening that high rate, that high engagement in widening participation is maybe having a protective effect, rather than keeping the status quo. So just looking at the data on the screen now, the green line at the top is the high ACSES schools that aren't engaged in widening participation. You can see there's a drop in enrolments. These are Year 12 students going straight into Semester 1 the following year at university. I'll talk about the limitations of that as well. But there's over that period of 2018 to 2024, there's been a 3 percentage point drop in enrolments from those high SES schools. The interesting one is the blue line is we tried to match as close as we could, but we had different starting points. But these were also low SES schools, but they had no engagement. They've gone through a net 9 percentage point drop in immediate post-school enrolment at university, compared to the highly engaged students, where there's less than 1% drop in enrolments for that group of students. There's significant data limitations in this. We're only able to track students going straight into university from school, and we know lots of students don't take that direct route, and especially students who come from those underrepresented cohorts. We're only able to track whole schools. We can't track individual students, and we thought that would be a reasonable proxy, and it was for a while. But I think that's coming to an end in terms of how valuable that data is, and given how much widening participation we can do with the available funds. And the other limitation is that our engagement data is not as refined as it needs to be. Our universities report back to me, and I collect that data on engagement with each year level, and from minimal engagement where a couple of students are going on a camp or doing something, so you're not going to see a whole cohort effect, through to multiple touch points for the whole cohort. So it's a bit of a rough measure, and I don't think that's adequate either. So that's what we've done. I think the challenges it points to is, there's data challenges, there's the resource challenges of having that sort of intense engagement. And I want to refer to the UK Higher Education Access Tracker here, because they started a bit after us, 2014, and they've finally released, for the first time I've seen, a quasi-experimental impact design work that's shown that students participating in intensive outreach activities had a 29% higher chance of accessing higher education compared to their peers with minimal engagement. We aren't able to do anything like that, and that's because we don't have that granular data. So I think that's a very different model. It's an expensive model. They've had to invest a lot of money in setting up that infrastructure. I know when we talked about it here in Australia back in 2014, there's also, who's going to collect that data? Do we have access to that data? There's, where we still have ongoing privacy issues and access issues with getting data on school students. But I think we need to, in an era of change, we need to re-examine what more we can do to get that data. And the sort of data we have accumulated really isn't cutting it with the Vice-Chancellors. They are after impact data. So I think that's the direction we could look at. And in terms of impact data, we've also discussed with Patricia and other members of the consortium whether we could do some impact work. We can't really do that alone. No one, I think, can do that alone. We really need to work with others to get that numerical power. And just quickly, have I got time to talk about my ACSES Scholar project? So I was lucky to become an ACSES visiting scholar last year and spend some time working with Gemma and others over at Curtin. And one of the things I did was a data mapping exercise. So I've been looking at data from schools and tertiary data for years, and just to put it all in one place. And thanks to the ISSR team for their work on CHEAF that did some of that initial data mapping of administrative data that should be useful for helping us track and evaluate. And that's going to come out fairly soon. Gemma's working on getting that published, so that'll be interesting to see. What is interesting is that there's a lot of data. There's about 100 records in my table, but there's a real lack of consistency in that data and what's published and what's available from across the system and state to state. So interesting lacks of consistency, and I think, again, this is where we need more collaboration to advocate for better data access and also improvements in what's available. And looking at that, one of the things that I came across was the Tasmanian Year 11 continuation data, which made me think about looking at data not just for those students finishing Year 12, but what about the whole senior cohort? So this, I was able to do something similar, not the same, because we don't have the same access to ATAR data, but looking at students who enrol in Year 11 and what happens, what's the trajectory of them over the next 2 years. So this is the 2023 Year 11 cohort, and what happened to them, and compared by ICSEA quartile. So for the quartile 1 students that over on this side, the blue section are those students who dropped out during Year 11. They enrolled in Year 11, but they didn't come back in Year 12. And it's rough. It's apparent retention, but it gives us a good indication of difference. And then the next orange section are the students who enrolled in Year 12 but didn't complete Year 12. So the big difference there is that 30% of low SES students don't, they have the intention of starting senior school, they don't even finish it, compared to 10% for the highest SES quartile. The big grey section in the middle are those students who they finish Year 12 but they don't go through QTAC. They have no interest in going through QTAC for a university application. About 24% for high SES and 25% for low SES, 50% for low, 55% for low SES schools. So that's a big area and a big difference. And people were talking about the continuum of, there's more similarity between quartiles 1 and 3 than there are in quartile 4. So advantage can be very high in this, and these are only state schools, so it's going to be different if you add in other schools. At the other end, I won't talk too much about what happens after application, but at the other end, you've only got 9% of low SES Year 12 graduates going straight into university, compared to 50% of students from high SES schools. So really big differences. If we're going to solve this, we need to look at those other areas. In terms of the Hunger Games that has been talked about, there's only 10% left of the low SES students at the moment who've got an interest. So if you're just going to fight over them, then we've really got problems, because what about the rest? So just finishing, I think in terms of collaboration at a state and national level, it's necessary to advocate for better access to data, and to be able to do stuff with data once you've got it. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks, Geoffrey. And thanks also for touching on the issue of tracking students. So there is a question that's currently the top rated about using USIs to track students. So I might come back to that after everyone's spoken. So Fiona, could you tell us about the work you're doing at Edith Cowan University, collecting, I guess, additional data on your students?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I'd like to outline some of the work ECU has been doing at the institutional level to expand our focus on equity groups beyond traditionally recognised equity groups. And this really came from ECU's strategic commitment to serve diverse communities. And while that's in alignment with decades of national policy, we also recognise, and of course there's critique in the sector around, there's been significant societal changes since the government equity groups were introduced, but not a significant change also in what we're looking at in terms of those equity groups. So ECU decided to introduce some data collection and broaden our focus. And then helpfully the Accord came along and recommended the collection of more granular equity indicators, particularly for students likely to experience educational disadvantage, but where their outcomes were not monitored systematically. And so we set out to explore what do we collect now and why, and what should or could we collect and how. So to start that process, we looked at established precedents. So we went into what's in legislation, what's in the TEXA guidance notes, but also looked internationally at what other higher education systems collect, as well as the Australian census, and came up with some indicators that were not routinely captured in Australian higher education. We then looked at the research and said, well, what does research in higher education say are other equity groups? And again, where can we not see those students or have visibility of those students within our systems? And so that gave us a range of different indicators that we went to students with, and we said, we want to ask you some additional questions about you and your lives, but we understand that some of it could actually be quite personal and you might not feel comfortable sharing that information with the university. So to what extent would you feel comfortable sharing these kinds of information? And so we asked them about carer status or being a parent or guardian, asked them about ancestry, race or ethnicity, about sexual orientation, about religion, social security or income, marital status, and also labour status or employment, and how they felt about those different groups. So we found really strong support for carers and parents or guardians, and also strong support for students from refugee backgrounds. And then the rest were fairly similar in terms of how much students supported that, but less so for religious affiliation. And so once we had that input from our survey of our students, we went through a process of refining and implementing what we were actually going to look at. And through that process, we really prioritised what students told us, but also really thought as an institution, well, what's in our strategic plan? What do we have capacity to focus on within our resourcing, and where are our expertise? And also, where's our institutional maturity? So, for example, we did have a conversation about the LGBTIQA+ community and recognising that there's really diverse experiences and identities within that group. But as an institution, we felt, well, this is just the first step for us in terms of thinking about LGBTIQA+ students. So let's just start there, and once we develop maturity, we might delve further into that work. So alongside the approach, we also developed some guidelines for what we wanted to be doing. And as an institution, we agreed that this was optional. It wasn't information that was required by government, so it would be optional for students to provide the information. We also wanted to make sure that it was a census approach, and so that it wasn't going to be a survey that we had to ask for permission or fit around other surveys. It would be part of onboarding processes. So we wanted it to be changeable, so something that students had control over. They could go into the student system and change it at any time. That it had to be consistent with government laws and privacy and data use. We had to have really strong governance use around it because of the personal nature of some of the questions, and so we've got data protocols on how it can and can't be used. And also be really clear with a transparency of intent and tell students why we were asking this information, how we would use it, who would have access to it. And so what we ended up with is the group of indicators on the left of the screen about asking students if they know which Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community group do you come from or do you identify with? Are you a parent or guardian? Are you a carer for someone with a disability or who is frail-aged? Are you or your family from a refugee background, a care leaver or out-of-home care experience? Or are you part of the LGBTIQA+ community? And so through the enrolment process, this is asked of all students and it's voluntary, and students can, for most of them, choose yes, no, I'm not sure, I'd prefer not to say, or they can skip the questions completely. And so I guess in going back to our guiding principles around intent as well, it's prefaced with a small paragraph about why we're collecting this information and how it will be used, which is primarily for student support to inform the programs that we provide, but also the messaging and support we provide to them personally. It's been in place since November 2022, so about 2.5 years now. And whilst it's voluntary, we've seen a high uptake, so about 85% of domestic students engage in the questions to some degree, whether that's completing one or all of them, but many of them do complete all. And so we've started to use the data in a range of ways. I think it's really supported our institutional conversations around who our students are and the practicalities of studying. At the moment, we have a fantastic student success data analysis who makes available to schools data packs about their schools. And so being able to talk to them and saying, well, you have 21% of your students who are parents or guardians. They have daily or regular responsibilities. What does that mean for timetabling? What does that mean for how we offer student support services? It also has influenced the programs or group programs that we offer for students. Also in orientation, we have an LGBTIQA+ orientation session, and we've seen just using that personalised communication has really increased the engagement with that particular session. We've also used it to look at the representation within programs that we already offer. So who actually are our mentor leaders, and is that representative of our broader student population? Being more explicit in our scholarship criteria, because we heard from students that unless they see themselves in that criteria on the scholarship, they probably wouldn't apply. So some of our equity scholarships have expanded. And I guess going back to as the recommendation from the Accord about monitoring outcomes, now that we are 2.5 years in, we can start having a look at some success and retention and seeing if there are patterns there, and you know, join me in celebration and a sigh of relief that yesterday we got ethics approval to be able to share some of that information with the sector now, because we were also very intentional in making sure that information was internal with the strict data protocols as well. And I think one, I guess, incidental finding recently has been in relation to retention. So we see that these voluntary group of questions, it's one of the first kind of behavioural indicators that we have of students, and there's a small subset of students who just skip them completely, and they're more likely and highly likely to be leaving ECU in their first year of study. And so I think that's something we'll explore a little bit more, but was an interesting insight from our data team. And so I think in terms of why should we care about this kind of data, I think without it sometimes we risk that whole experiences or stories of inequity are going untold, and we don't know who our students are and what their experiences are. And we know data is a really important tool for shaping what we do, shaping our policies, but also holding systems accountable as well. And so I think particularly when we're asking quite personal information from students, we have that impetus to make sure, as Geoff said as well, we're using it to drive real change and to inform our actions. And so I wouldn't say at ECU we've got that 100%, we're on a journey with this data.
Thanks, Fiona. And I think I and everyone here will be really excited when you can release some of that, the results as well. So Kristy, from the department's perspective, could you tell us about the collection and use of equity data across government?
Sure. I'm bucking the trend and I don't have any slides, so you'll have to look at my face, sorry. For those who don't know me, my name's Kristy Naylor. I am the data custodian for the higher education student data collection within the Department of Education. You might also know it as the taxi data, which is another name that we go by, or the verified data, which is written into a lot of the legislation for your funding agreements. I also look after the university staff statistics as well. And within our branch, we manage the quilt surveys, the university applications and offers data as well, and the monthly international student statistics, as well as some reporting for the OECD education statistics, which has just come out recently if anyone is interested in having a read of that. So across all those data sets, we collect an abundance of information about students, about their background, their demographics, as well as their study characteristics. And from that, we either directly collect information reported by a student about their equity status, such as self-reporting Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander identification, as well as self-reporting one or more disabilities, and we collect information about a student's address when they begin university to derive their low SES background and regional and remote background of students. The data is used widely across the Department of Education, but also across government. We provide that data to TEXA. For their purposes, we give the data to the SRC to form the quilt survey frames and reporting. We now have our relationship with ATEC. We'll be supplying that data to the ATEC as well, as across, ACSES gets a lot of data as well to form the basis of the dashboards and the reports, as well as Productivity Commission, Jobs and Skills Australia. So I can almost guarantee that everyone in this room has had some kind of touch point with that data at some point, even if it's not, if it's just like through this forum, because we have seen a lot of talk about data over the last 2 days as well. So internally, the department relies on this data for policy development, which has an evidence base, as well as program administration and the allocation of funding and evaluation of those programs as well. I'm going to skip that one for the sake of time. But one of the most impactful uses of the data that I've seen recently to support evidence-based policy is understanding how the different, how attrition rates and success rates, which is really a pass rate, we don't get information about actual grades, just a pass or a fail, how that differs by particular cohorts of equity students that we were interested in understanding. So students from low SES backgrounds and First Nations students. We did a bit of statistical modelling, which I will spare you the details of, but basically we controlled for other demographic characteristics of students, which we know also impact attrition. So we've heard a lot about ATAR. We were controlling for ATAR, for the disability status of students, for age, gender, and their part-time status in studying. And even when controlling for those other demographic and study characteristics, we found that low SES, or students from low SES backgrounds, were 4 percentage points more likely to not enrol after their first year. First Nations students were 6 percentage points lower, less likely to enrol after their first year. And if you were identified in both of those cohorts, even more. And with the pass rate, it was even more pronounced. So 6%, you were 6 percentage points more likely to fail at least one unit of study if you were from a low SES background, 11 percentage points more likely to fail at least one subject if you were from a First Nations background. And so this really gave the department some evidence to help develop policy around these particular equity cohorts. Another interesting thing that came out of this study was the relationship between ATAR, a student's ATAR, when they're entering an undergraduate degree, and their likelihood to drop out after the first year or to fail at least one study. And we saw that students with a higher ATAR, even if they were low SES, were much less likely to drop out and more likely to have a higher success rate. They're statistical models, so they're a predictive analysis. The models had fairly reasonable, like moderately good predictive power, but it was very clear that there were some unobserved characteristics or demographics that weren't being captured, which we highly suspect have to do with caring background, job status, which is data that we don't have at the moment. So like to go back to some of the comments that were said yesterday by some of our colleagues who I highly respect the opinion of, like low SES at the moment is calculated from a student's address. It's a proxy measure. We don't have personal data about students to determine a personal indicator of SES. So we've got what we've got at the moment, and it's a reasonable proxy. The department and our ATEC have this on our agenda. We know it was raised through the Accord. So yes, the low SES is a proxy measure. We don't have that personal information at the moment. But we still, when we look at these outcomes for these students, they are systematically lower than the non-SES background students.
Thanks, Kristy. So we're going to go to questions now, and I'm just going to, because Kristy's next to me and in the hot seat, there's a question about access to data, and a question saying that data, so as a PhD student, data access is incredibly difficult. I'm assuming this is to the department. Requests get rejected or redacted. Any tips for improving access or getting data? So I guess just any general comments you have about getting access to data would be great to hear.
The higher education, I'm not quite sure. I think redacted there might mean suppressed. So the data that's put out by the department and across like anyone who's collecting and reporting on data, we have to comply by quite strict data governance arrangements, legislation. The Privacy Act is like the key. No one wants their data plastered or all over the internet or to be identified. And so a lot of the data that we release needs to be suppressed so that individual students can't be identified in that data. Across government, we try to do that in a way which maintains the utility of the data, you know, by not over-suppressing, but sometimes it can be really hard, particularly when you're talking about these quite small, underrepresented cohorts of students. If you're interested in intersectionality, like you're getting down to quite small numbers, and often that data just has to be suppressed or redacted. In terms of getting access to the data, the department does publish a number of pre-ready self-service tables. I think I've just been dealing with some highly anticipated data that may or may not come out shortly. And there's over 125 different data tables that, you know, we actually produce, so it's quite extensive, as well as some pivot tables which allow you to self-service, but we can't put everything out there. I know NCVER has quite a nice data lab. That would be my dream if I had an unlimited bucket of money to build something like that. Data requests won't be rejected by the department, but sometimes they do come with a cost. which is just a partial cost recovery because we can't keep up with the demand for data in this day and age.
Thanks, Kristy. I've now got a question that I think would be answerable by everyone on the panel, so please just jump in. So it says, I guess it's more of a comment, but it says, would love to see USI used to its full potential from pre-access through to completion so that we can evaluate activities and supports. And then there was an additional question as well, talking about the tension of collecting more data and tracking individual students with increasing fears of surveillance. So is anyone wanting to talk about the potential to use the USI for tracking, perhaps in the pre-access space, moving into higher education?
My understanding is that there'll actually be 2 USIs. There'll be a school USI and a tertiary USI. So I know that, is that still correct? Is there anyone? Huh? Yeah, that's right. It's not a USI then. But that was my understanding of how the new school USI would happen.
I'm not sure about that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's going to be difficult. I think there's some developments in data that data linkage that I think we can hope will achieve some things. There's some good stuff in terms of open data that some states have picked up on and some governments have picked up on. But I still think it is complex. There's all those legislation requirements and those privacy requirements, but in terms of accessing data, we need to get more organised about working together. Like get an individual asking for data or even an individual institution asking for data is much less powerful than a sector asking for data.
That's a very good point. Fiona, did you want to talk at all about how having a USI or being able to track students would benefit you at Edith Cowan?
Yeah, I think for me, the thinking about the USI and when students get to us, what do we know about them, and how easily can we access that information? So we've been doing a bit of a deep dive in some of our enabling students, and we can see that there's actions that we can take to improve their success rates at the university level, but getting timely access to that data is really challenging. And so I'd kind of hope the USI would support us in doing that. I think one of the initiatives that Tim Rennick didn't really talk about this morning was what they have done at Georgia State University is a Summer Success Academy where they look at the students as they're entering Georgia State Uni, and there's a proportion, about 10% of what Georgia State would deem as academically at-risk students, and offer them this Summer Success Academy as part of their entry into university. I'd say taking the kind of best of what we know about enabling and setting students up for success as they enter their first year.
Thanks, Fiona. Angela, I'm going to put you in the hot seat for a second. And there's a question that says, release of national quilt data sets and reports has been delayed. And maybe I'm putting Kristy in the hot seat as well for this. You can decide. Are you able to provide any insights into what is causing this delay?
I think we get this question at SRC a lot, and as Kristy just described, there is a process and a decision-making mechanism for when the reports get released. We are also held to that process, so we release data when we are allowed to. The one thing I would encourage everyone to recognise is individual institutions get their data before the national reports. You often have your data for months and months and months and can be working with the data yourself within your institution to do some of the types of things that we're talking about on this stage, i.e. understanding what you need to do, using the quilt data to understand what you need to do to improve the student experience, to find pockets of students who need special attention, and do that analysis yourself.
Thanks, Angela. There's another question here that says, something that concerns me is the lack of intersectionality in our sector data collection. Can people on the panel speak to this?
I can say something. I think part of it comes down back to what Kristy said. In one of the earlier questions as well, we have to be sensitive to the personal information that we hold about individuals. And when you start talking about intersectionalities, you sort of imagine, sorry, I'm a data nerd, your crosstab or your pivot table upon your pivot table, where you start to create cohorts of people where you can identify them. So we have to think quite carefully and quite pragmatically about the privacy of the people whose data we're collecting. That does mean that there's times where we can't look at the intersectionalities that we would like to, but I think that's where I guess personal experience, looking at qualitative responses, just engaging with your student base, you can sort of start to understand some important trends or needs in those situations.
And ACSES has quite a good dashboard with intersectionality.
We haven't quite added it in yet,
Okay.
but it will be added soon.
Sorry.
We have a little
Spoiler.
bit. I think one of the difficulties is when we've got lots of different equity groups and then we can combine in so many different ways, you end up with a lot of data, and we already asked for a lot of data as well from the department.
Yep.
So, yeah.
There is a small table at a national level on intersectionality of equity cohorts in, I believe it's section 11 of the student data, if anyone's interested.
And I will say that ACSES has just put a data request in a couple of weeks ago to the department to get every combination, like a count of every combination of equity grouping. So all the intersectionality just counts at an institutional level across the last, 10 years or something. So I apologise, but we will publish that when we get it, so we can at least understand the intersectionality counts at each university, which I think will be just quite interesting as well.
Yeah, I reiterate what's been said about just needing those big numbers to be able to get the data that's still confidentialised, but also to make sense of it. So when you get down to really small numbers, it just doesn't make sense. It just goes all over the place. So that's what I've found with the Queensland data anyway, when I've tried to drill down further for some of the smaller equity groups or combinations.
Yeah, because there's diversity within the equity groups as well.
I'm going to go to another question. I don't know if people can, I think everyone can see at the top of Slido, it has like the themes that are coming up, and the one with 5 mentions is data, and the next one is Kristy. So, so Kristy. I think this is in reference to the retention success modelling you were just talking about, and someone has asked, will the department publish that modelling findings? And also, and I guess this goes to the needs-based funding work, what did the modelling say about students from regional areas? Because we know, I think, that under the needs-based funding, regional students themselves won't receive the funding, but it will be regional campuses, not the students.
Yep. That modelling was internal. There's no plans to make that publicly available, and regional and remote status wasn't included.
Thank you. This one is to Geoffrey initially. So it says, how did you/Queensland unis get the Queensland state government interested in equity in higher education? And also, are you happy to share your data? Is that what it was, John? Okay, yeah. So I guess if another state or territory wanted to do something similar, how do you get the government to buy into that?
Okay. Look, it's an interesting journey, and as we're talking about change, there has been change over time in terms of how much the government has been interested. For a long time, they've been a bit of a minor party in the consortium. At the moment, it's sort of flipped the other way. Just when the universities are wanting to go their own way, the department's saying, "Oh, this is a really good thing. We should be pursuing this." So we'll see where that goes. That'll be really interesting. I think sometimes ministers see themselves as the Minister for School Education, and so if your minister sees themselves as the Minister for School Education, you really have to pursue their interest in schools rather than university or tertiary study. But you can get ministers who see higher education as part of their portfolio. I'm not being very helpful. I'm sorry. It's a hard one. It's an ongoing battle to engage state departments because of the funding mechanisms and so forth. And in terms of sharing data, I think that's a very separate question. We'd have to really think hard about that one. States are very protective about their data, and I know there's been a lot of tussle with the Australian government about their requirements for data and you know the DAT Act and what that means for data. So they're not necessarily going to easily share it.
Thanks, Geoffrey. I've got another question for Kristy, which says, current timing of taxi reporting used for HEP calculations is too late and has implications for equity project delivery. What can be done under needs-based funding?
That's a big one. I'm not specifically sure about needs-based funding. That's a policy and program. From a data perspective, the timeliness of the higher education statistics collection is often brought up. It's not a new thing. I think what isn't quite understood is that the data collection isn't supposed to be real time. What we need from this particular data collection is a stable annual collection of data. We need all universities and all HESA approved private non-universities to submit data. That includes their completions for the year and their third trimester, which often you don't know until February, March the following year. After the data's submitted, we go through quite a lengthy quality assurance process. I've spoken to some people in this room because I've emailed them and asked them, your data moved quite a bit. Is this an error? Or, is there some real world reason why your data's moved? So we take the quality of the data really seriously. And so there's quite a long process to get that data out into the public. The department is committed to working towards how we can get more timely data out in the public. And I think we've seen that this year with the Minister using some more preliminary data in some of his reporting. So we'll do our best there. I'm not quite sure what can be done in the needs-based funding space.
Thanks, Kristy. So for the last 5 minutes, when we've got the panel up here before we go into the interactive session, and I don't know if I've asked everyone in the panel, so I apologise. We've been very positive in our presentations about, the innovative uses of data, but I'd love to get the panel's opinion on what you believe is missing from data in higher education, and if you were ruler or leader of the world for a day or a week, what you would introduce to improve data and to understand equity outcomes sort of better. So I don't know who wants to start. Has anyone thought about this before? Yeah, Angela.
I'll go first. I think for me, I'm sort of driven by how you use data to make improvements and how you use data to make change. I think there is a lot of data available. It's about being directed and brave and setting strategy based on data and then measuring success. I think any of the data nerds in the room knows there's a phrase called data paralysis. It is very common to get stuck up on, oh my God, do we have perfect data? So I think you need to actually just think about the data you have, the problems you're trying to solve, and make risk-based decisions about the analysis you do and set goals in using the data.
Thank you. Geoffrey?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there is so much data out there. I'd like to see some better coordination between data and better, especially across the states and territories. Like if it's okay for some states to release data for one thing, then it should be for others. Like there is lots of data that could be better released and better quantified, similar measures. And I know all the states and territories talk to each other, the TACs all talk to each other. They've got these mechanisms to do that. So that would be on my wish list in terms of data, especially for the school data, to understand what's happening in schools.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Fiona?
So I'll put in the request from the data team at ECU, which is really to obtain via taxia students' first address, and therefore SES and regionality at the point of enrolment for any Australian higher education institution, not just the current institution that they've come to, and access to one centralised student address geocoding solutions. We've got inefficiency as different providers have different solutions, coming up with different answers.
Thanks, Fiona. And Kristy?
I think it's probably my job to just listen at this point. So, put in your requests. One of the things that I found really helpful is the department chairs a disability roundtable with advocates from the disability community, which includes students, and that has been like the most valuable forum that I've been involved in from a data perspective, to get that student focus on the data and what the data means to them, and what they want to see out of the data. So that would be my bid, more student-focused data and needs.
So you think we need to set up a data panel for data lovers out there? Maybe.
We have got something, but for the sector, it doesn't have students yet.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. So I think that's the end of this session. So if we could all just thank our panellists, please, for their insights. And then they are going to walk off the stage, and I'm going to stay up here for another awkward few minutes. So if you go into Slido and into the polls section instead of the Q&A, and if you could answer the question I just posed to the panellists. So basically, what data do you think are missing in Australian higher education? So it could be data that's not collected, or data that is available but you don't have access to, or data that's not linked to other types of data. So if you could put your answers in, and then I'm going to try and read some out and just otherwise sit here. And I don't know any magic tricks, so I apologise. Oh, and I think as well you can see them coming up on the screen. So a lot of mentions of USI, which is not surprising, and the ability to track students. Data explaining why students have dropped out. So that is something that I'm quite passionate about as well. So the NCVR has a survey of students who are no longer enrolled, but we don't have a similar thing within higher ed. We have the graduate outcome survey, but not a survey of students that did not complete their degree. So I personally like that one, but I actually didn't write that. So there's one about paid work alongside their studies, and I'm not sure if that's a plant by Ian Lee. But we do have, ACSES has funded a module as part of the QUILT Student Experience Survey, which nearly all universities are participating in this year, and it has about 12 questions asking students about their paid work. So we will get the data early next year, and we'll be able to release it probably mid next year when the national data set comes out, so please look out for that. And I think the geocoding as well of students' first address. So I know from speaking to universities that one of the issues that they do have is geocoding addresses. It should be reasonably easy, but for some reason it can be quite difficult for universities to do that. And I'm not sure that it's something that the department can sort of I don't think you can sort of get that information back through Taxi. So yeah, I do agree that that is a big gap. All right, I technically still have 8 minutes to be up here, and I just really don't want to just keep talking for 8 minutes. So, Ian, have you got any magic tricks? Oh, brilliant. As long as you don't saw me in half.
We do provide back some geocoded information to individual universities for your own data if you're interested in that. So you can't get it directly through Taxi, but many institutions do send an email to universitystatistics@education.gov.au to get their own information back.
Thanks, Kristy, that's really helpful. So keep putting your data gaps into the polls, and after the symposium, Ian will do some fancy analysis, and then we will also share the common themes across that. And then at ACSES as well, we'll look to see how we can address those too. So I think that calls an end to this session, and now we have, well, I'll let Ian talk about afternoon tea.